And we are live. Hello and welcome to Fermenting Opinions. I'm your host, David Pyden, and this is Fermenting Opinions, the podcast in search of a more palatable political and, in today's case, theological ferment. This is April 23, 2022. I'm joined by Erin Burnett and Nick Peters, and we're going to talk about something that is, again, not related to politics at all. Something a little bit different than the normal. Nick and I, we just did a thing about a week ago. He participated in a debate regarding the resurrection. Nick is a Christian apologist of the Deeper Waters Apologetics program. And Erin is a author. Her book is titled "With All Your Mind: Autism and the Church." What we're talking about today is the perspective of individuals on the spectrum towards theology, towards church participation. This is a little bit different for me because, as anybody who knows, anyone who's followed the show for any amount of time, I'm an atheist. I've been an atheist pretty much my entire life. I've been an atheist since like the 7th grade. So what am I here doing this conversation, trying to help the church with people with autism or whatever? My own personal take, and I'm just getting this part out of the way, just kind of for my own edification. I'm a person who believes in inclusiveness. This for me is about wanting to see people live their lives the way they want to, and be accepted by society, whether or not it's things that I personally participate in or approve of or like or whatever. I think that it's really important to each person to be able to follow their own path. So that's kind of what I'm doing here as sort of a supporting role for this conversation that I just kind of wanted to facilitate. But really what I want to get from you guys is what have your experiences have been, interacting with the church, interacting with theology in general, just the very topic, and kind of like what your life stories have been regarding those things. And I don't know who wants to go first, but I would want to hear a little bit more from each of you, like kind of the work that you've been doing, and then we can get into some of that stuff. Sound good to you guys?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Very good. Nick, would you like to go first? Kind of talk about your stuff?
Sure. Well, I do it from a virgin birth, in case anyone's wondering. First off, and I do my work at deeperwatersapologetics.com, and I was diagnosed to be on the spectrum in 5th grade, I think. And Erin, in her excellent book "With All Your Mind," just about how when she was in school, making friends was easy. Go up to people and talk about Pokemon. Well, I didn't have that option because Pokemon didn't exist then, but there were video games still, and that was the way I connected. I understand I was the first person in my county in Tennessee, Knox County, to go all the way through the school system on the public school system on the spectrum. And there were a lot of specialists who told my parents things like, "Oh, he'll never finish school, he'll never go to college, he'll never drive." Been there, done that, did all of them, do more still. And for me, being on the spectrum, it's in many ways to me a gift, very helpful because my mind can absorb ideas very easily and hold multiple thoughts at once and pretty much be kind of like a walking encyclopedia. I mean, my dad and I sometimes go downstairs and watch Jeff Foxworthy's American Bible Challenge. I could pretty much sweep an episode entirely very easily. But there's also a sense that you're always an outsider on the spectrum. And for me, especially in a church setting, it's a lot of times when people talk about their theological experiences, it doesn't really resonate with me, especially when people talk about, I think there's a lot of Christian cliches out there. When people say, "Oh, every time I read the Bible, I just get something new out of it," or about how excited they are to pray and things that sort of say, "Oh, well, we really feel the Spirit here," and if yeah, every now and then that kind of thing happens for me, but you're treating this like it's a regular occurrence, and that doesn't connect. And generally, like worship experiences. Most of the times, music in church doesn't do a thing for me. Honestly, I have to be doing something else dealing with sermon, or else my mind will wander too much. I did this actually when I was at ETS recently, when I went to a session on learning Greek, which I'm working on. And need to say, okay, I'm just going to put my phone down, my laptop down. I'm just going to listen and absorb everything I can. I heard maybe the first sentence and missed everything else. It's just the way my mind works. So that's my experience.
Gotcha. Some of that resonates a little bit with me. I did, when I was a child, I was Catholic and went to Catholic church and so on and so forth. But yeah, like the people would talk about like personal revelation and being caught up during like the singing sections of a church service and stuff like that. Yeah, I never connected with me either. So maybe not for exactly the same reasons, but like it that resonates at least a little bit. Erin, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what some of your experiences have been.
Okay. So I'm from Northern Ireland, Belfast, and I think in many ways Northern Ireland's quite comparable to the American South in that we are by far one of the most religious parts of basically all of Europe. So that was the context in which I grew up. So I've always gone to church. My parents would probably just your average mainline Protestant Christians, very lovely people. But I ended up, of my own accord, joining a fundamentalist church. And if you want, later on, I can talk more about why I did that, because I think it's related to my autism in a way. I got my autism diagnosis when I was in my final year of school. So I had just turned 18. And after I finished school, I did theology at university. And it was while studying theology, I had what I think most people would call a deconstruction. My old fundamentalist way of looking at things no longer worked. So I had to find a way that was still consistent, because I didn't want to leave the church. I think I tried to leave the church and lasted about a month. There's something about Christianity that I just can't stay away from. But I knew my old fundamentalist paradigm was just not going to work. So I've ended up as what you would probably call a progressive Christian, but I'm always changing, always thinking, and I don't want to really pigeonhole myself. As for the autism, sorry, were you going to say something?
I was going to ask, for people who may not understand that the nuance here, because when you say progressive, especially here in the U.S., that creates a certain connotation that's political, really, rather than having anything to do with theology. That makes you a little bit further, kind of along the line of, towards the farther left, right? But progressive Christianity, that's not exactly the same thing. Could you explain just briefly kind of what you mean by that?
It's I suppose a critical way of looking at Christianity that isn't afraid to change over time. So, for instance, the way a progressive would look at the Bible, they wouldn't necessarily say that it is infallible. I think we can believe that it is inspired and that it is still very useful without being infallible. So a progressive would accept there are errors in the Bible and wouldn't be particularly worried about that. I'm trying to think of other examples. Socially, I suppose progressives are more likely to support things like same-sex marriage. Yeah.
So, so maybe there is a little bit more of a combination with being a little bit more progressive politically as well, or socially, I should say, as well as sort of having a different theological view with regards to, things like infallibility. But I guess you're still kind of maintaining that the same core tenets are still the same. Is it also true that there's some kind of overlap there with universalism, or like the idea that like everyone gets to go to heaven, essentially like a rejection of the doctrine of hell? Are you there with that personally, or is that not really part of progressive Christianity per se?
Yeah, I think it's a spectrum. So really you've got everything. I'd probably say personally I'm in a middle of the road perspective, what you'd call conditional immortality, in that I don't necessarily believe everyone goes to heaven, but I also don't believe in eternal hell. I think it's this Bible verses that suggest for the unsaved, it's just an end of existence rather than eternal torture.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, okay, and I think some people call that annihilation. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
if this is boring anybody who doesn't normally get into theology. Like, I like listening to this stuff and learning about it. So, like, I'll have to check myself and going on too many tangents. But interesting. I guess to follow from that, what was it about? What drew you to the more fundamentalist theology initially, and then what caused that deconstruction, and what was that process like?
I think there are two main reasons. One was purely social. So I was about 13 or so, I think, when I changed church, and high school was just dreadful. I had no friends. I didn't fit in. And I suppose I was at the point of life where I was looking for a community. I was looking for some sort of certainty. And despite having gone to church all my life, I'd never actually sat down and read the Bible properly. So I just decided, right, I'll read the New Testament cover to cover and see what happens. And of course, I wasn't diagnosed autistic at this point, but in hindsight, the signs were there, because I took it all extremely literally, like very, very literally. So I then wanted to find a church that would take it as literally as I did, which is how I ended up in a more fundamentalist church. In many ways, I don't regret that decision, because they were very nice people. I found the community I was looking for. They were very supportive of me. I do, however, regret, I think, the person it turned me into, because I think I became extremely judgmental. I looked down on anyone who didn't believe the exact same things as I did. But in the end, it was going off to university and studying theology that changed me. Even though I did go to an evangelical college, so I wasn't studying it from an atheist point of view or anything, but yeah, I think just reading much more deeply into it, reading about lots of different views, being around lots of other people with different views, it ended up, dramatically changing how I thought about things, which I think is the point of studying theology. So.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I was actually, it made me curious, Nick, actually, when you were sort of first learning scripture, or first engaging, did you take more of a literal type approach to the text as well? And again, not to pigeonhole you, but would you consider yourself more of a fundamentalist, or kind of where are you at?
I'm definitely not a fundamentalist anymore, but yes, I grew up in the South, and Southern gospel music is the big thing for many of us down here, and so was pre-trib, pre-mirror dispensation, or the rapture is coming at any point. Yeah, and now I've come the way that I'm an Orthodox preterist, and I tend to not read scripture at point in a literal way. With Genesis 1, I go with John Walton's approach to it. I prefer to say what N.T. Wright says, so I read scripture literally, but not literalistically. And I mean, that I eventually said, it's hard to say, I had to stop listening to Southern gospel music, because it's hard to hear songs where every other song is about the rapture when you don't believe in it anymore. And my theology has changed drastically since I was growing up, and I first read the Bible in middle school, and I suspect I took a lot of it literally too. But I first went that way until in my own deeper studies. They actually didn't lead me more into skepticism. They led me more into thinking that, wow, this is really foundational. I mean, that's something else that I think makes it difficult about church for many of us, is because we can be sometimes on another level, and we have to go talk with the people who are on that level to get something. And then most church, unfortunately, seems to be a lot of times reaching, that person who just walks in. And there is a place for that, but we need something too. That's one reason I'm hoping to go to New Orleans and study, because I want to be in an academic environment.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that makes sense. And I guess it's my own experience. I also live in the South. I'm also living in Tennessee. I used to attend Bible studies for a denomination called Church of Christ, and they
Oh
are
yes.
very, very fundamentalist.
Oh,
There's two different kinds. One is actually a little bit more progressive. This one is not. And it was kind of an enormous fear. I think one around deconstruction, and two around just not reading the Bible as a literal history of the world, for example, and every word as being literally true and inspired, and that if you kind of move away from that as a guardrail for your interpretation, then like all becomes lost very quickly. And I think in a way that they've, because I've interacted with several of, they're not really young anymore, but at the time younger members of that church congregation, who they started to have questions, and as soon as they abandoned a literal interpretation of scripture, most of them are atheists now. And this isn't I'm not point scoring. I'm not trying to rah for team atheism or team Christianity or anything like that. But like, because this paradigm was set up, was either you interpret it literally, or it all goes out the window. You set this up.
yeah.
I've watched so many people leave the church as a result of it.
Mm.
But neither of you really did that. What was it about? And again, maybe Nick, you didn't go through a deconstruction process necessarily, or maybe you did. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but about that process that allowed you to kind of morph your understanding without just kind of throwing it all out.
Well, since you mentioned me last, I think I would take this one
Okay, and then I'll
first.
go to Erin. Okay,
Yeah,
very good.
a few things. Say first off, the Bible college I went to was part of a restoration movement, so I'm very familiar with the Churches of Christ. And the seminary I first went to was pre-trib, premill dispensational. So every Bible college I've gone to, I've fundamentally disagreed with something there. And second, the story that you've told about this, it reminded me. I've got a friend, and I've got a blog about him I can share if needed, named Roger, the who went to a very, very fundamentalist school here in Knoxville. And we worked together. And then years later, he calls me, and he's on the verge of atheism, wanting help. And the first chink in his armor, he said, was when he found out that 1 John 5:7 wasn't part of the original manuscripts. And it took weeks and months of working with him, talking, but today he is a strong, devout Christian, and I'm very proud of him, very glad I've been in his life for that. But for what it was like for me, I didn't go through the doubts so much of if Christianity isn't true. I went through the doubts more of what if I'm not true? And it was a fear of not really being a Christian and facing that. And when I went to Bible college, I was still struggling with this. But while I was there, I found out about apologetics. And it was, wow, I can use my mind together to understand my faith. And that gave me something I could latch onto, because in my past, most everything had been emotional, experiential. And you can't base any worldview on emotions. I don't care if it's atheism, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Mormonism, Islam. You basing any worldview on emotions is just foolish. And that took me through a long process of reading everything I could get my hands on, which hasn't stopped to this day. I was still living at home. My mother would panic pretty much every time I went to the bookstore, because I come home with this big handful of books. And I've had to clean out my library 2 or 3 times so far, moving from place to place. And my folks are saying, yeah, if you're going to New Orleans, you're going to need to clean out again. It's like my life's blood draining out of me there. I mean, thank God for
It's
Kindle.
a painful process for bookworms. I can
Yeah.
sympathize.
Thank God for Kindles nowadays. But yeah, my studies just strengthened my faith. And I think because of being on the spectrum, I'm allowed to take so many things and mix them all together and find combinations a lot of people don't see. It's like being I like reading mystery novels and stories like that. So it's kind of like being a theological detective, taking all the pieces and seeing how they all fit together.
Gotcha. Very interesting. Well, we've got a question here, but Erin, I was going to go to you first. So, sort of your takes on moving away from that fundamentalist interpretation, and that I guess as part of your deconstruction, and kind of what that process looked like that you maintained your faith as a result.
Yes, I think I moved in a slightly different direction to Nick, although the process was similar. So as part of my degree, when I was doing my dissertation, I did it on autism in the church, which was the research that was the basis for my book. And I came across some really fascinating research when I was doing that basically vindicated why I found faith difficult. And it said, so autistic people are statistically way more likely to be atheist or agnostic than neurotypicals. And there's a few theories for that. One theory is that again, I don't want to generalize. I'm always very worried that I'll say all autistic people think this, which is absolutely not true. But
for sure,
a certain subsection of autistic people just really struggle with the idea of the supernatural in general. And that's sort of the camp I would fall into. They also tend to be less likely to think teleologically, which means we're less likely to see a grand overarching purpose. We're more likely to just take things at face value. So that was quite an interesting revelation for me. And then I was looking at, is there a form of theology that is compatible with this way of thinking? And there's a certain school of Anglicanism / Episcopalianism in the USA, which looks at Christianity without the supernatural interpretations. So the most famous person who did this is probably Bishop John Shelby Spong, who most people consider basically an arch heretic because he is, but he would interpret Christian doctrines like the resurrection, the virgin birth in more of a naturalistic way. So we're still getting meaning from it, but he doesn't necessarily believe that there's supernaturalism behind it. So I found theologies like that really suited my way of thinking, and they were able to keep me in the church because I wanted to stay in the church, but at the same time I didn't want to feel like a hypocrite professing something I couldn't really believe, whereas that sort of theology gave me a way to engage with Christian ideas while also not going against the way I think, if that makes any sense at all.
Somewhat. It sounds to me, and again, I'm going to ask this to clarify rather than, again, to try to pigeonhole. Do you struggle with accepting divine causation? I know sometimes people use supernatural as a pejorative, and I don't mean it in that sense here. But regarding supernatural causation or these effects, do you have a hard time just accepting those in general? Is that kind of where you are now? Because, and I've heard, again, we all throw around jargon and terminology and things like that, but I've heard a term before called religious fictionalism, of somebody who derives a sense of identity, community, purpose out of participating in a religion, and enjoys a sense of ritual, and derives a great sense of meaning out of that, and a great sense of belonging out of that, but still doesn't really accept sort of the literal propositions regarding the divine, essentially. Are you, again, not to say that you are that, but are you somewhere along the lines of falling in that, or not really?
I think so. I've read quite a bit about religious fictionalism, and a lot of it does resonate with me. I don't quite want to, as you say, pigeonhole myself, because I think my faith is an ongoing journey. I don't want to say I've reached this point and I've stopped. So I could well change in the future, but I'd say that's pretty much where I'm at. And I think that's really interesting, because obviously you've got two autistic people here with two very different views of God and religion.
Yeah, no, and I think that's that's wonderful, honestly, in its own right. But no, yeah, I was very curious about that. Also, we have a live comment here. Is actually a good friend of mine, Ed, wanted to know if you and Nick now interpret the Bible using critical exegesis, or does that question even track?
I'm wondering what's exactly meant by critical exegesis in terms too
Maybe we'll
vague.
have to, maybe we have to revisit that one. But anyway, we can come back to that maybe if he comes back around to clarify. But but anyway, I guess sort of at this stage, I wanted to talk about, and it was a thing that you had brought up before, Nick. Before we went live, and that talking about your your interactions with church congregations, and this may resonate for you as well, Erin, and your experiences with that, and within those environments, within those communities, what barriers are you guys seeing to inclusiveness? And what are some things that that these organizations might change to be more welcoming
Well,
to individuals on the spectrum, of course.
Yeah, I think part of it is Erin's got a lot of great things in her book. I highly recommend her book entirely. But I'd add in some other things. I really don't like church greeters. A lot of times people come up to me, and if someone comes to me and just says, "How are you?" I absolutely hate and despise that question. Because in reality, I'm thinking, you don't really care. You're just saying that. If you want to know how I was, you'd reach out to me during the week. And who of us would like to go up to someone and say, "Hey, how are you?" And say, "Gosh, I'm feeling miserable today." Okay, what have I got myself into? But that's what happens. And also with touch, a lot of people give unwanted touch. If someone comes up to me and I can tell they're getting ready to pat me on the back, I mentally brace myself for it because it's coming and I don't really want it. Now, someone will ask, "Can I give you a hug?" If they know I'm going for something hard, and I say, "Okay, sure." And they do, and I don't usually give anything back, but they appreciate it. The church and society as a whole, I think, tends to value extroverts a lot more. You're supposed to be outgoing and talk to people. And I find it so strange that someone comes up to me and they try to engage me, and I don't really respond, and I'm the rude one in that sense. Couldn't it be the rude one is one who's not minding their own business right now? And I'll say we don't usually take change very well. I walked into my Sunday school class one morning, and the tables have been rearranged. I did not say anything that whole class because I could not think straight because it had changed. One of the main ways I'd say, I think Erin says this also, to get into the autistic person's world really is to find something they care about. Talk about that. Erin and I both have a passion for video games, for instance. You talk about those, we're in. And I remember being at a sober recovery once when I was married, and I'm sitting on this couch, mind my own business, and my wife's across the room talking to someone. She tells me about the whole conversation later on. I just hear her say apologetics, and whoosh, off to the races. I'm over there. Did somebody say that? You get into our world, and you treat us well, and we will be loyal to you. We want to belong, but we're scared of fitting in and engaging with people because I think on the spectrum, rejection is a very big thing for us.
I can get that. And Erin, what about you? What are some of the sort of hiccups or difficulties that you've had with regards to interacting with with these organizations or just going to church in general? It may not be exactly the same experience, but what had that been like for you?
Pretty much echo everything Nick said. Other things to add: certain types of worship can be quite inaccessible. So the very loud contemporary rock concert type worship services. Yes. Good grief. Yeah.
Is that, and sorry to interject, is that like a sensory thing? It's like too much in terms of a sensory thing.
Yeah, too loud, too bright. And again, I absolutely don't, I'm not saying no church should be like that because lots of people get a lot out of it. Just for me and for most
Yeah.
autistic people, I don't. Yeah, it's a nightmare.
Oh yes.
What
That's
else?
something that can make you think hell could be real after all, right?
Yeah, if someone's and I've worked with, and I've mentioned this to Nick before, but like I've worked with individuals on the spectrum for the last like almost 15 years,
Thank you.
and it's within people who they have a lot of other disabilities and things like that. We're talking about things that are a lot more profound in terms of functionality and independence and stuff like that. But I've seen these things when people who get overstimulated and they get overloaded, and you have to be aware of those situations, because it can be legitimately traumatic. Yeah, so much sympathy for that. So I guess the question, to follow from that is, if this is a thing that is, like you said, other people are maybe getting a lot out of that, and that's absolutely a turnoff for you. Is it just a matter of kind of picking and choosing what kind of events you're going to participate in, or is there some kind of accommodation that can be made within these environments? I know I've been to there's a church not too far from here that they have, for example, like this nothing to do with the spectrum, but a deaf chapel, right? And it's the way that they have like little vibrating boxes under the seats that would simulate the rhythm of music. They would have this light program coordinated where they would dim lights in order to get people to stop their conversations because they're getting ready to start a service or a program or what have you. And it was all very catered to the deaf population. Is there anything like that congregations could be doing? Maybe not even necessarily on that level, but are there other things they could be doing to improve inclusiveness?
Yeah, I think one very simple way is just providing earplugs. That, I'd say in most cases, that's probably enough. Or if the church is simply too much in terms of worship, what quite a few churches are doing now is broadcasting the service into a quieter room, which, I mean, not only autistic people, there's probably quite a lot of people quite like that. So yeah, it's a way to still participate in the service, but in a more quiet environment.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I kind of like that idea too. Nick, what about you, sir? Any suggestions with regards to improving the inclusiveness of an environment? Say that for a place that might get kind of loud.
Yeah, I remember when I was married going to a concert with my wife, and it was a group called Red, and she really liked them. It's a lot of loud music, and everyone else was, up there kind of like a mosh pit thing, dancing, celebrating, cheering. I'm in the back saying, "Oh Lord, if you want to come right now, this is a great time." Yeah, I'd say I think it's just everyone you meet on the spectrum is also different, and don't go up to them trying to be Mr. Friendly right off, because that tends to scare us. There's an inherent distrust of most people. And I'd say also get rid of anything that I prefer to call Christianese, where you speak in Christian terms that other people don't understand. And if you're talking to someone who's a very literalistic mindset, you could cause a whole lot of trouble. Just imagine going up to someone who's on a spectrum and saying, "Are you washed in the blood?" That does not go over well at all. I we take things so literally when people say that. I've actually considered sometimes working on doing comedy at places, talking about life from the autistic Christian perspective and how you take things literally. I mean, sometimes I take things literally just for fun nowadays, just to see how people will respond to it, see what people mean by it. But I don't think I can really add much more to what Erin said.
Gotcha. Yeah. No. Actually, it's funny that you say that, talking about the comedy bit. Not too long ago, I watched I guess Elon Musk, who is, I believe he has Asperger's.
Yeah.
He did like the intro to like a episode of Saturday Night Live, and he did this bit about, talking about needing to let people know that he's really meaning what he's saying, because just the lack of inflection when he talks sometimes, but that can make for a really great comedy, and how literally he speaks sometimes. So I think there's potential there for you, Nick. I think there's potential. I could never do comedy, but I think there's definitely potential for you. Ed, he's come back to clarify, and hopefully we can engage in this just a little bit here. It says using critical exegesis to me means that you take into consideration the culture of the text, the speaker, the language, and the audience. It's an attempt to get into the world of the text originally meant, which is often different from a Sunday school type interpretation. Like, going back, to me, that was always my goal when I would read scripture, is to understand it as it was intended by the author at that time, not necessarily to fit like a meta narrative. But like, what was the author really getting at? And is that something you guys did/do? Do you find that helpful or not?
Very.
Yeah,
okay, so you're both just saying yes.
Yeah.
Asked and answered. Very good, guys.
Yeah, I found something that's really helped me with the Bible a lot is the social science perspective. Realizing the Bible comes from an honor-shame culture, which is very different from our modern individualistic culture. And when I tell people about reading the Old Testament, what I tell them honestly is, say, when you first read the Old Testament, I want you to stop being a Christian for a while. Because I want you to imagine you were a Jew before the time of Jesus, and you don't know anything about him, and you're just trying to understand, what did this text mean back then? And now later on, you can put on your Jesus spectacles and look and see where Jesus is in the text. But for a bit, and you're always trying to say, okay, well, here's the text. How can I find Jesus in it? Here's a good question to ask first. First, what does the text mean? And then you can put on your Jesus spectacles.
Yeah, I think that's an important aspect too. It's one of the things, as a skeptical person, it's been the fodder for many an argument online, of course, as to whether or not someone's kind of starting with a conclusion that there is divine inspiration behind some piece of scripture, or that there is Jesus, as you say, in this somewhere, and then finding out how it fits after the fact, in sort of a post hoc kind of fashion. So no, I really respect that approach, Nick. And Erin, you say you do pretty much the same.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest contrast between how I read scripture now and how I used to. So the fundamentalist will literally just take it at face value, whereas yes, a more critical approach is going to think about things like culture, context. Yeah.
Gotcha. Very good. Very good. Well, I guess we're sort of at the stage of, if there's anything else, any other, actually, there is one other thing I did want to get into before we wrapped up. Erin, you had mentioned sort of earlier the prevalence of being agnostic or atheist amongst individuals on the spectrum, that there's a kind of a higher correlation there. I guess I'm just looking for your guys' sort of thoughts on that. Again, we're not saying all. I don't want to talk in sweeping generalizations. Obviously, every individual is different, but there is a stronger correlation there, and I was wondering if you could expound a little bit more on how you account for that.
Who shall go first? I can go.
All right, go ahead, Erin. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is because autistic people do tend to be deep thinkers. They are very logical, quite empirical. So they're less likely to just accept a faith because that's what they were born into. I think if you want to reach out to autistic people, probably the best way to do it is Nick's approach, which is to go through apologetics, because apologetics is defending the faith in a way that is very logical. And I think that's quite a good way to reach autistic people. Or you could go my approach, which is more progressive and heretical, but yeah. As for why there is that prevalence, I think a lot of it just comes down to not feeling what people would call sensus divinitatis. So
Yep.
a lot of neurotypicals talk about having, you know, a personal relationship with Jesus or some sort of otherworldly connection to God, which is wonderful for them. But
Yep.
I've just never really felt that. And that made me
Mhm.
feel like a terrible Christian and an outsider in the church. So
Mhm.
yeah, perhaps that's another thing. If, again, I don't want churches to stop teaching that, because that's very good for some people, but just to
Yep.
recognize that not everyone is going to have Jesus as their best friend, but there
Mm.
are other ways to relate to him and his message.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree on time. In fact, it's kind of interesting. Erin and I, our first interaction together was on another show talking about this, and we both said the exact same thing and came from opposite perspectives. Where she said it's difficult to believe these things because you're so logical, and I said it's easier for me to believe these things because we're so logical. Because for me, I was thinking the emotions don't really get in the way. It's one reason, for instance, the problem of evil has never really resonated with me as very problematic. I was thinking about other things we could add, though, and one I wanted to include, and Erin does mention this in her book as well, is that many people on the spectrum are also nonverbal, and even those of us that can talk, we still often, I think, have some degree of nonverbalness in us. If I'm behind someone at the grocery store checkout line, and they got their order there, and I'm trying to get that barrier thing, just to plug my, and I can't reach it. I'm simply trying to point, do everything I can, because there's something in me that says, I know I need to say, can I have that? But I can't bring myself to say it. It's a mental
It's
block.
like the verbalizing is kind of like a last resort in these
Yeah.
situations. Is that
Yeah.
okay?
And so many times, I mean, I wrote a blog most recently. People, when you respond by, and you don't say anything, but you gesture or things like that instead, they think you're being rude. And that's
Gotcha.
definitely the last intention. I mean, yeah, we can be rude if we want to be because we're humans. But most of the time, we're not wanting to be rude. We just can't bring the words out.
Yeah. No, and that makes a lot of sense to me personally. There's a lot of people I think who don't understand, who just see sort of from the outside, and they have those, they project that expectations of neurotypicality on everybody. And if you're
Mm-hmm.
not acting within that, then you're being rude, or you're being a weirdo or something
Yeah,
like that.
and
And it's
and
just a
our,
lack of exposure and understanding.
yeah,
I mean,
our illness is also invisible, as it were. Because if someone comes up to you and they're in a wheelchair, you're not going to challenge them to a foot race. You know not to do that. That's stupid. But if we walk in, appearance wise, we look just like everyone else. There's not some big glowing sign over our head saying autism, autism, but it's there.
yeah, absolutely. I think that's honestly pretty good note to wrap up on. We got one more comment here. Oh yeah, possibility. Okay. Sorry, this is gonna be terrible radio. I'm just gonna read his comment. He said Nick is verbalizing something that I think is very important. The inability to verbalize this, I think, is a real positive of these two guests on this podcast. Why, thank you, Ed. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I will sort of put a bow on it there at that point. I really appreciate both of you taking your time. Nick, I know you're a little pressed for time. You got to get to work. But Nick and Erin, this was very enlightening for me. I enjoy these kinds of conversations. Again, this goes outside of my wheelhouse a little bit in terms of perspectives. But I think it's important to meet people where they're at and encourage them to follow their own paths without me again, as an atheist, wanting to like paternalistically be no, you should stay away from the church because atheism's right and Christianity's wrong. All that stuff. It's tribalistic hot air, and I just don't agree with it. I've kind of turned a corner, I think, with some of those things. So I really enjoyed getting to hear from you guys on your perspectives on this and the recommendations and things like that you've made to encourage, hopefully it's exposure, if nothing else, to get people to think about these things a little bit more when approaching somebody, without the assumption of whether or not they're on the spectrum. Like you said, it can be invisible to a lot of folks. So I'm going to give you each an opportunity to kind of plug your stuff again, and then we'll close out. Nick, do you want to go first?
Yeah. My stuff is at deeperwatersapologetics.com. I do have a Patreon, so anyone who wants to support us, even I do, and it'll definitely help for us. I'm planning to go to New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary and study down there, so all the support I get can be good. And I do indeed affirm the virgin birth, and I'll go ahead and Erin's going to plug it, but I'll go ahead and say her book is excellent on this topic. And she's also got another great book she wrote as a teenager called Liza's Avenger. If you like some good fiction, I found it to be a very enjoyable read.
Very cool. Okay, Erin.
So my books and articles and various other things are at erinburnettauthor.co.uk, or I also have a Facebook page, which is also Erin Burnett Author. It's a very inconvenient name because Erin Burnett is, of course, a CNN newsreader who steals all my search engine results. But yes.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know that. Anyway, again, thank you both so much for taking the time out to talk to me. For myself, if you're watching this now, you're probably watching it on YouTube. I have my YouTube channel, Facebook page, and group. Check out fermentingopinions.com and the RSS feed wherever you get your podcasts. That said, I'm David Papiden. This is Fermenting Opinions, and we'll see you next time.